Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of the previous lesson from Hebrews, the 11th chapter of Hebrews. We made it all the way up to the 22nd verse. We're going to begin in the 23rd verse today. But before we do that, we just want to establish the fact that in the previous discourse we established that faith can be defined in dictionary form. Even so, it is better understood through experience, and the author of Hebrews provides several models or prototypes of faith throughout the Old Testament through which we may safely emulate in our own walk of faith. But even so, we feel that a dictionary definition is necessary to give us a fuller and more total understanding of faith. And faith, we established, is the composite of several interchangeable ingredients. Now, in the opening verse of the chapter, the author establishes that faith is believing without seeing, and that is foundational to faith, but it is not the whole of faith. Faith also entails a degree of patience. It's to believe in the promises before they materialize with faith that they will. So there's an aspect of endurance, and faith connects us to the eternal, and as such, there is nothing fleeting or temporary in the flickers of faith. There's no such thing. It is something more longevity, and it is also obeying in spite of the consequences and regardless of the circumstances. Now, all the things that the Father commands us to do are not necessarily easy, and rightly so, and they may not add up or make sense at the moment, but we follow them fully with the expectation that it will add up and make sense. And this is established now. We made it all the way up to the 22nd chapter, and the author provides examples from the book of Genesis, three characters from the antediluvian: Abel, Enoch, and Noah, and then the patriarchs of the Jewish faith. And then from the 23rd verse, he begins with Moses. So by faith, Moses, having been born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a comely child, and were not afraid of the king's command. Now, when Moses was born, the Hebrews were enslaved because after settling in Egypt, they had grown to be a nation within a nation, and so numerous were they that one of the pharaohs, the most historically reliable estimate would be Amos, who established the new kingdom. But we don't know for certainty, but that's besides the fact. And after a certain point, some 400 years, even so, they had begun, even in their enslaved status, they posed a threat in that they were too numerous. So the reigning Pharaoh ordered the execution of the firstborn sons, and the parents of Moses, they defied this order by hiding the baby Moses, who was their firstborn. And they were not afraid of the king's command. So fear and faith are antithetical, no more than they cannot inhabit the same vessel, at least not simultaneously. So that's another aspect of faith. It can be understood through its antithesis or opposite, which is fear. By faith, Moses, having become great, refused to be called the son of the daughter of Pharaoh. So he was adopted on the river. They sent him adrift in a basket in a river, and on the Nile, and who notices them but the daughter of Pharaoh, who adopts him, and Moses is raised in royalty. So he had the possibility of all the luxuries of a prince with none of the responsibilities of ruling, and he discarded that life because by faith he held a greater purpose for himself. What might have been beneficial to him was not necessarily to the benefit of his people. So once he developed an awareness that he was in fact Hebrew, he identified with the enslaved class, who in all likelihood he probably didn't give too much thought before he realized he was one of them. Choosing rather to be afflicted with the people of Elohim than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a time. So he made a conscious decision to discard the palace life of luxury without responsibility, and he chose to identify with the afflicted, enslaved class, even though he had the option to remain in royalty and royal splendor and princely pomp. He saw a superior way, which was not the easier way, but it was the right way. Deeming the reproach of Messiah greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So even though the Messiah had not yet come, he identified with the Messiah, and he alluded to him to come in Deuteronomy 18:15 through 18. But the riches that he could claim through his affliction and suffering were greater than any worldly or temporal riches that were available to him in the palace of Egypt. And he was looking to the reward, so he didn't have a concrete idea of what the reward of the resurrection may have been, or at least not to the full extent that we believers of the New Covenant and the current dispensation do, but he still had faith, and he was rewarded accordingly. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he was steadfast, as seeing him who is invisible. Once more, the dynamic of faith manifesting through the absence of fear is present, though he had a lot to fear from the wrath of the king, who we may have known as brother or stepbrother, and yet he was able to approach him to say, "Let my people go," and the Pharaoh was notoriously hard-hearted, and it took 10 plagues, which are incidentally indictments of the 10 deities of the Egyptian polytheistic pantheon. And by faith he performed the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So the Passover is a pivotal event of the Jewish calendar. It marks the remembrance of the occasion when the 10th and final plague was the death of the firstborn. Even Pharaoh was not absolved of this plague. And the way the Hebrews spared themselves was marking their doorpost with blood of the lambs so that the angel of death would pass their house. And this was the 10th and final plague, which finally compelled the Pharaoh to accommodate Moses' request to let his people go. But being a hard-hearted man, he has a change of heart, and by the time that the escaped Hebrew nation approaches the Red Sea, he comes with his army of chariots descending upon them. And the greatest miracle of the Exodus was the parting of the Red Sea, which drowned the Pharaoh's army. By faith they passed through the sea of reeds, as by dry land, and when the Egyptians tried it, they were drowned. So much of what I said before this verse I could have said after, but the concept remains the same, that they were drowned and subsumed by the sea, which engulfed them, which the Hebrews were able to walk through unmolested by. By faith the walls of Jericho fell, having been surrounded for 7 days. So this refers to post-Exodus, early Joshua. Jericho was a city of strategic significance. Archaeology proves that it's the oldest city in operation in human history. Its origins can be traced to around 12,000 years BM, but it was still, it existed in the Promised Land, and the forces under Joshua were instructed to encircle the city for 7 days, after which time the walls came tumbling down. And by faith Rahab the whore did not perish with those who did not believe, having received the spies with peace. Now, Rahab is an unusual character for the Hall of Faith. 1, she was a Gentile. 2, she was a prostitute. That's 2 strikes against her, but the Father is capable of working through even the strangest and most unlikeliest characters to manifest his perfect will, and Rahab was exemplary in the faith which she demonstrated by action of harboring the spies and supplying them with the needed intelligence. She was an indigenous inhabitant of Jericho who did not meet the fate of her native countrymen, or citizens of the same city-state. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to relate of Gideon, and Barak, and Samson, and Japheth, and David, and Samuel, and the prophets. So these are figures in the period of judges to the early monarchy, who each have their individual stories. Gideon, his faith was not immediate. He was aware of his humble station. He when the angel approached him, telling him that he would be the accomplisher of Israel's deliverance from the current oppressor, I think it was the Midianites, when Gideon liberated them from, he demanded a sign and the sign solidified his faith, and he defeated and vanquished the oppressing army with 300 soldiers. The idea being that if they used all the soldiers at their disposal, they would cease to give credit or acknowledgement to Yahweh, who was able to work the mightiest miracles through the smallest and humblest of instruments. And Barak was contemporaries with Deborah, who was a female prophetess, as indicated in Judges 4:4. He would have been earlier to Gideon, and Samson was perhaps the outstanding figure of the book of Judges, reputedly the strongest man who ever lived, and his existence was oriented towards the deliverance of the Israelites from the Philistine oppressors who remained a threat, at least until the early monarchy, when David, he established his claim to fame by slaying the giant Goliath, who taunted the Israelite enemies, challenging any one of them to single combat to settle the dispute. And Samuel was the final judge of Israel, who gave way to the request of the people to have a monarchical form of government, who through faith overcame kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions. So these are specific manifestations of faith in action, and there are multiple ones, but stop the mouth of lions more specifically refers to Daniel, who he refused to relent on his pattern of prayer, which was to offer prayer to Yahweh thrice daily, and he didn't shut his window, so the Persian courtiers, who were jealous of the influence which Daniel yielded, devised a scheme to demand exclusivity of worship to the Persian emperor. And now the laws of the Persian emperor could not be rescinded once enacted, so Daniel was forced to meet the fate of the blasphemers who were thrown to the den of the lions, but the hungry lions did not have the appetite for the sanctified man who walked in the protection of the Almighty. Quench the power of fire, escape the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, became mighty in battle, put foreign armies to flight. So this is a continuation of the list of manifestations of faith. Quench the powers of fire, that was specifically refers to Daniel's three companions, Shadrach, Abednego, and one other, I honestly forget, but they refused to, during the previous power under whom Judah was subjected to, which was the Babylonians, the Nebuchadnezzar erected a golden idol of himself, a statue of himself, commanding all to worship him at the prescribed time, and they stood tall when all others bent on knees, but they were subjected to the fire, and the fire did not consume them. And being made strong in our weakness, the old saying goes that man is never so powerful as when he's on his knees, and never so tall as when he's on his knees, and never so strong as when he is weak, because from weakness we can lead on an inexhaustible, omnipotent strength. And the principle is expounded perhaps most fully in Paul's writing in 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, 7th through 10th verse, the famous thorn of the flesh discourse. Women received their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting release, to obtain a better resurrection. So the resurrection has, even before the Messiah's full and complete resurrection, there were instances he raised Lazarus from the death, but that was not, strictly speaking, the resurrection to come, because he remained encased in mortality even though he was resurrected from death. And also the prophet Elijah resurrected, I believe, a widow's son from the town of Namath in the 4th chapter of the 2nd book of Kings. And torture will test your faith like nothing else. Men of wavering faith will renounce their faith at the mere suggestion of torture, but men of extraordinary faith will not procure their release, and in fact endure the torture, and in so doing give a powerful witness and testimony of the Almighty. And others had trials of mockings and floggings, and more of chains and imprisonment. So the idea that pain is not part of the path of discipleship is patently false. People who live a pain-free life are very much the exception rather than the rule. And it comes with the job description of the prophet and disciple, and we are to bear them willingly and not grudgingly, and to maintain the faith throughout. They were stoned, they were tried, they were sawn in two, they were slain with the sword, they went about in sheepskin and goatskin, being in need, afflicted, mistreated. Stoning was the standard form of capital punishment as prescribed in the Mosaic Law. Sadly enough, many prophets and men of faith were not spared of the application of that execution of capital punishment. And sawn in two is a specific reference to the prophet Isaiah, who, according to tradition, was sawed in half by the wicked ruler Manasseh, who reigned 55 years and set the standard for wickedness amongst Judean monarchs. And sheepskin and goatskins, and being needed, afflicted, mistreated. The prophets, many of them gave palpable impressions of not being comfortable in the ways of the world, and they frequently gave visible sermons through visible demonstrations which communicated a verbal message. Of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes of the earth. So the world wants nothing to do with the saints or the disciples or the prophets, and the prophets and disciples only are concerned for the world but want nothing to do with the ways of the world. We are still very much invested in the world's welfare, although we are not contaminated by its influence. And having obtained witnesses through the faith, all these did not receive the promise. Now, these are references to believers of a previous dispensation living under the terms of the Old Covenant, according to which they did not have the fullness of the promise of the resurrection, but Elohim rewards the faithful in proportion to the knowledge they hold, and there's no reason or inference to suggest that the saints of the Old Covenant are not entitled to the fullness of heavenly splendor. Elohim, having provided what is better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So once more, what I could have said after the verse I said before, but the idea is that Elohim always provides, and what he asks may tax our faith, but we do have faith that he will always provide, and he will not forget us or forsake us, and that is an ironclad guarantee and a promise. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.